be here. And means to Father Zuder, who's been a friend of mine for many years. And I want to first tell you, I've heard for years about the wonderful work that cafe is doing. I'm very proud of you because anything we can do to promote the faith and understanding of the faith here on the campus is so important. And for Catholics to get together and to have fellowship and to share their faith is so important. So I think Cafe is a wonderful organization. I'm very proud of what you're doing, what you've done and what you're doing. And many of us priests are very supportive of it. Just to let you know a little bit about myself, I'm an almost native of Albuquerque. My family moved here when I was 8 years old, and I grew up in Northeast Heights. The Annunciation Parish was my parish, and graduated from San Diego High School. I entered the seminary right after high school. I wanted to be a priest from the time I was a very little boy, from the time I made my first Holy Communion, certainly. And my family kept on waiting for me to outgrow it. Like, you know, little kids say, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a fireman. But I fooled them, I never outgrew it. And so, thank God. And I have some association because part of my history is I was the first altar server and the first cantor at Our Lady Perpetual Help Church back in the 70s when it was going. It's a long story that we don't have time for tonight, how first I learned how to sing and how to serve the Byzantine rite. But for the time I was a little kid, and because we had visiting Byzantine bishops, Melkite bishops coming. Then when they began the mission, I served. But about that time, my voice broke and I became a tenor, and they decided they needed someone to sing more than they needed someone to serve. And then I became the first cantor there. And then later on in life, after I was ordained a priest, I received bi-ritual faculties from the Melkite Patriarch to help them with some of their work. So I've had occasion, a few times over the years, I got to pinch hit there at Our Lady Perpetual Help. That was so nice to go back. I'm a Roman Rite priest, though, and I've served in 3 parishes. I was the pastor of Roy, New Mexico. Do any of you know where Roy, New Mexico is? No one knows, and you'll never know. Because it's itty-bitty. It's Harding County, northeast New Mexico. Do you kind of know where Clayton is? Some of you know where Clayton is. Kind of. You know where Las Vegas is? I don't mean Nevada, I mean New Mexico. Take a string between Clayton and Las Vegas and put your finger in the middle of the string. That's Harding County. When I was there, there was only 1,000 people in the entire county. Holy 600 Catholics, 399 Protestants, and 1 Jew. He was my good friend, Alan Forsham, who was also the chief mason. And he was the only mason, I think, you know, but we got along real good. So I was there 3.5 years, and then I went to Moriarty. I was the pastor of Moriarty in Edgewood for 9.5 years. And now I've been the pastor of St. Thomas for 23 years.
Yeah, you were a record.
Long time. Despite my youthful appearance, I'm 61 years old. And so, who knows, maybe I'll stay there until I retire, maybe I won't. But I've loved every parish I've been in. And God has something for us wherever we go. So it's my great joy to be able to be here tonight. I was told that I was to talk about what we commonly call the Counter-Reformation. Paul did the Reformation. I'm sure you gave equal time to both sides, right? Yes. By the way, another claim to fame, I received Paul into the church. How many years ago?
A little more than 7.
That's right. I received him into the church.
So I guess I'm old enough now to receive Holy Communion in the Roman Church.
Probably. But you know, we call it the Counter-Reformation. But I really think a better name for it is to call it the Catholic Reformation. Because the phrase the Counter-Reformation makes you think that the only reason it happened was because of the Protestant revolt. That's not true. Actually, the Catholic Reformation was already underway before Luther. It was coming about, just like the Protestant Reformation had its roots before Martin Luther. We're coming up on the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Traditionally, the day that he nailed the 95 Theses onto the church door in Wittenberg, October 31st, 1517. So, November 1st, Lutheranism will be celebrating its 500th birthday. We always think of that date as traditionally the moment when the Protestant Reformation began. But had deeper roots. In the 1400s, everybody agreed that the church needed to be reformed. No one was happy with how the church was in the 1400s. There were some actually Protestant groups before Luther, very famous, at least Protestants in flavor. John Hus and the Hussites, who were there in nowadays we call it the Czech Republic. The Valdensians, the followers of Peter Waldo, who still exist in Italy. They're itty-bitty, but they're really Italian Lutherans, or what they are. But they existed before Luther. And in fact, when you go to St. Peter's now, and you go driving back across the Tiber, there's the big Valdesian church that they built, which could hold every Valdesian in the city of Rome, but they wanted to build it. And there's a big mosaic on the front of it that says, Lux in tenebris, light in the darkness. In other words, we're the great light here in the darkness of Rome and popery and all that other business. But they're from before the Reformation, okay? And the Lollards, the follower of Wycliffe, the English pre-Lutheran reformer, existed. So there were already these kind of proto-Protestant attempts to reform the church before Luther ever did his thing. But many, many Orthodox Catholics understood that the church needed to be reformed too. But what was their difference? It was that they said religion needs to reform men. Men don't need to reform religion. In other words, the Catholic reformers would say, it's not the religion that needs to be changed. It's the people who practice the religion who need to be changed. And so that really gives you the whole distinction between the Protestant reformers who wanted to change the religion and the Catholic reformers who said, yeah, there needs to be change, but not in the faith. There needs to be change in those who practice the faith, especially the hierarchy. And there were many people before Luther who were calling for authentic Catholic reform in the church. Because if you look at, the 1400s were a terrible time. Well, the 1400s produced a lovely group out of the lowlands called the Brethren of the Common Life, who were simple priests who devoted themselves to intense piety. One of them, maybe you've heard of his name, Thomas the Chemist, who wrote the book most popular next to the Bible, The Imitation of Christ. The Imitation of Christ showed up about, we don't know exactly, 1470, 1480. Certainly Thomas à Kempis, Father à Kempis, was part of it, if he didn't write the whole thing. But The Imitation of Christ, which is such a precious book, really, next to the Bible, if you read a book, read The Imitation. The Imitation comes out of a whole movement that was called the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, the attempt to go back to a very authentic piety, the personal relationship with Christ, great simplicity, was born out of the age right before the Reformation. Something had to be happening right in the church if a movement that could produce such a beautiful book of such pure spirituality could have come from it. Also at the same time, in Italy, priests who spontaneously realized, and laity who realized that they needed a reform, an interior reform, were founding a lovely group called the Oratory of Divine Love. The Oratory of Divine Love. And these were groups of priests and laymen who met together for prayer, who voluntarily lived a life of great spiritual discipline, who performed works of charity. They flourished in the late 1400s and early 1500s in Italy. One of their great produce and one of their great leaders was St. Cajetan, who was so inspired that he actually began a group of priests formed off of the Oratories of Divine Love, and they're known as the Theatines. And the Theatines were a reform order that took place before Luther even came about. They were founded about 1510. The clerks regular is what they're called. The Theatines, by the way, we don't have them in New Mexico, but we have them right next door to us. They're in southern Colorado.
San Luis.
Exactly. The old bishop of Denver, when all of Colorado was one diocese, Denver, he invited the Theatines to go over from Spain to take care of the Hispanics in southern Colorado, who, culturally are New Mexicans, okay? It's, when the United States drew the line between the United States and Colorado, well, of course, New Mexican Hispanic culture had flown over the border. And the priests who are still up there, taking care of the priests are before the Reformation. So, the brethren of the common life that produced the imitation of Christ, the oratory of divine love, these were efforts of Catholics, even before Luther, to bring about reform within the church. Great pre-Reformation thinkers knew that there had to be reform. This was, of course, the 1400s. So many things happening. It was the age of humanism, right? The great humanist, the Enlightenment come out. The humanists can be divided into two groups. Those who are authentically Christian and those who were reverting to paganism. Okay? The ones who were reverting to paganism did great damage to the church. Sadly, some of them even were among the hierarchy, even cardinals, even tainting some popes before the Reformation. But the Christian humanist wanted sincere reform within the church. Who would be the greatest of all the Christian humanists of that age who were going for reform even before Luther? St. Thomas More, certainly. The greatest of all the humanists would be St. Thomas More. You join him to show an example of authentic humanist, Christian humanist among the hierarchy would be St. John Fisher. Would be Henry VIII ends up killing the most wonderful layman and the most wonderful bishop alive in Christendom at that time. And John Fisher was calling for reform way before Luther ever appeared. Erasmus was one. And Erasmus, he's a funny bird. He was no saint, okay? Erasmus was no saint. But he always stayed an Orthodox Catholic. And he both hurt and helped the church, because what was Erasmus's gift? He knew how to savage people with satire, and so he savaged the abuse of the church, and that didn't help because he made the Pope and the hierarchy look like fools. But also he prodded them to reform without leaving the church himself. Erasmus always stayed a faithful Catholic. He disagreed with Luther. So within the church, before Luther even shows up, there's all these people saying that there's a need for reform to go on. We can just briefly go through what were the things that needed to be reformed. Well, number one, probably the great wealth of the church. The church had lots of money. It had accumulated ever since the peace of Constantine to its day. And in the ancient world, well, until modern times, really it was just beginning to evolve, how did wealth express itself? Land. The church had become, over the course of 1,000 years, 1,200 years, the major landowner of Europe. And that was how wealth was primarily produced. Much of the wealth went to help the poor, the patrimony of the poor, but not all of it, by a long shot. Wealth, great wealth for the church, never ends up doing much good. The interference of the secular powers in church appointments is that the secular powers would forever interfere about who would be appointed bishops and the like, wanting to put in their favorite people, not always thinking, often not thinking about the good of souls. The whole phenomenon of absentee clergy. Bishops who didn't live in their diocese. As we'll talk about in a few minutes, in a little bit, when St. Charles Borromeo finally got to go to Milan, where he was the archbishop, he was the first archbishop of Milan to live in that city for 80 years. All the other bishops of Milan lived in Rome, where the fun was. And they would just have a vicar general, a priest who would run the diocese for them. You had absentee bishops. You had absentee pastors. You see here again, the problem was the clergy, once you were appointed to a parish, how did a priest get his money if you were appointed to a parish back, let's say, the year 1500? They didn't take up collections. People didn't even have ready cash like that, like we have nowadays. It came from two sources. Number one, the parish probably owned land, and the priest got the rent of the land. And number two, everyone who had agriculture had to pay the tithe. And the tithe was enforceable by law. I mean, you were punished, you were tossed into jail if you didn't pay the tithe. So the priest was guaranteed an income. And if the land was particularly valuable, if it was, the tithe was very big, many priests would sublease the parish. They get some other priest and say, well, okay, I'm getting, let's say, £1,000 a year. I'll pay you £200 to take care of the parish, and then he takes his £800 and, goes down to Sicily to chase butterflies, whatever he wants to do. And this was a very common thing where priests were absent from their parishes, bishops were absent from their dioceses. To make it even worse, you get priests who get appointed pastor of 2 or 3 or 4 different parishes. They're called pluralists. They collect the income. And then they'd sublease it to poor little priests who didn't have any income, and they themselves would disappear. There was a breakdown because of this in episcopal authority, meaning bishops weren't obeyed. No one paid any attention to them. Of course, there was the lack of education among the clergy and the formation of the clergy. In some places, again, you had some very highly educated clergy, but often you had priests, they could just barely read Latin, and that was it. That's all that they were able to do. They'd received very little training. Seminaries, as we know, didn't exist. That came from the Catholic Reformation. Priests really learned how to be priests off the apprentice system. You hung about your pastor and kind of learned how to do priestcraft, and that was eventually how you were able to go in and take your own place. Priests were not able to preach. They couldn't put 2 sentences together. They weren't educated enough to be able to preach. And it was a struggle. We get these accounts of this time where bishops are begging the priests, at least, will you teach the people the Our Father and the Creed? But even that didn't seem to happen sometimes. And with that lack of education formation, the clergy were setting a terrible example. Friends, this is why reading church history is interesting, because, there's been scandals in the church today. People say, are we going to survive? When St. Peter Canisius, who was the great reformer of the church in Germany, when he went into Catholic Germany, Bavaria, Austria, he did a visit for the Pope. He found 2 priests who were not living with women. Everyone else was. Two concubines. That was the word they used back then. 2 priests that didn't have concubines. Everyone else did. So you see, we hear about scandals, whatever, they're all terrible, they're awful. Things have been much worse. Things have been much worse. Okay, things have been much worse. And the Pope had lost his prestige. The papacy had lost its prestige. What had happened? Well, we know the Pope. I say the Pope, we're talking about many different popes, of course, one succeeding the other. First, they run off to Avignon in France because they don't like Rome. It's too hot, it's too muggy, there's too much malaria. Rome is kind of fallen apart. They take off to Avignon, which is, of course, in Provence, France. Provence, how nice, how cool, get to live in Provence. Nice weather and beautiful countryside and good food, and they live there 70 years, and finally St. Catherine of Siena badgers the Pope to come back, but no sooner does the Pope come back, but there's a big blow-up between the Italian and the French cardinals, and that's when the great schism of the West begins, and we have 2 people claiming to be Pope, and then it ends up turning into 3 people to be Pope. We don't have time to go into the reasons for the great schism. And of course, this creates scandal. There's 3 different people, 3 different bishops claiming to be the Bishop of Rome, each one being backed by different countries, different factions and the like. Well, of course, people get cynical about it. And then finally, when that's solved, at the Council of Constance, and Martin V is recognized as the one pope. We go into the Renaissance, and we get all these popes who are much more concerned about being Renaissance princes than they are about being the father of Christians. And Rome becomes the center of the Renaissance. And of course, the height of it, I mean, this is the age of what we call the five bad popes, right? Of who the one that took the cake was Alexander VI. Well, just, go on Amazon Prime or Netflix and watch the Borgias, okay? Which is the story, sadly, basically historically true, of Alexander VI, who is the Borgia Pope, who was probably the most corrupt of all the popes. Well, of course, this creates, terrible things in the church. And this is why there's felt to be such a great need of reform. Not just those who want to break away from the church, but within the church. There's a desperate need to reform the church at this point. All these problems taking place. Where, after Luther, again, Luther, 1517, he nails the thesis, okay? When does reform finally begin to happen in the church? Well, the first flicker of real reform after Luther is the election of Hadrian VI. He was Pope from 1521, 1523. Last non-Italian Pope until John Paul the Great. He was Dutch. He had been raised by the Brethren of the Common Life and educated by them. And he was a product of the Devotio Moderna, a product of the environment that created the imitation of Christ. Poor guy, he only lives 22 months. He comes in, he wants to sincerely reform the Curia, which is the Pope's central administration, but he only lives 22 months. And it seems like he's going to end, and a new Pope is elected after him, Leo X, who is a Renaissance Pope and just as worldly. But then an event happens that shakes the church. Clement VII, who came after Leo X, a Renaissance Pope, a political Pope, decides to make an alliance with France. The German Emperor, Charles V, is angry, sends his mercenary troops south, and something takes place that no one thought could ever take place. The Holy Roman Emperor's army sacks the city of Rome. May of 1527. Michelangelo was alive at this time. Indeed, he said that his inspiration for the Last Judgment came from what he saw when the city of Rome was sacked. Because it was horrendous. These mercenary soldiers came in, they raped convents of nuns, they cut the throats of priests, they desecrated altars, they grabbed every bit of gold that they could find, they stabled their horses in the churches in Rome, which had become this big Renaissance vanity fair, is reduced to a ruined city. And it shakes Rome to its foundations. And how is this possible? This is supposed to be the eternal city, the holy city of Christendom. How can it be that Christians themselves are sacking Rome and doing such terrible things to it? And that really was the end of Renaissance Rome. It really was the end of Rome as this sort of playland for the Renaissance and the secular humanists that were going on. It really was with the sack of Rome that people realized something was terribly wrong with the church. Rome had just become a vanity fair and that things needed to change. Who was the great agent of change that really helped reform the church? The Spanish Empire. And, oh, you are so good. Thank you. I'm recovering from an illness that I had over the weekend. I went to my doctor today and she told me its scientific name is the creeping crud. Everyone's had it, right? And you should see me, I was coughing away and I couldn't even sing the high mass at 9 o'clock. It was Of course, if you're a Byzantine Catholic priest, that's really a disaster. I remember I knew Bishop Mahalik in Parma very well, and someone went up to him and he said, well, what do you do with the Greek Catholics if you get a seminary and you can't sing? He says, well, that's simple. We send them to the Roman Catholics. Spain was kind of an exception to the corruption of the church. Spain had been fighting this 800-year war to get the Moors, the Muslims, out of Spain. Right? They had invaded about the year 800, and Charles Martel stopped them at the Battle of Tours, and it took, this actually 700 years to slowly push them out of Spain. So because Spain was involved in this war, and the whole country was on a war footing for centuries, the corruption didn't enter into the Spanish church nearly as much as it did in the rest of Europe. But Spain was blessed with some of their bishops, especially Cardinal Jimenez, who lived in the 1400s, who was, again, a great reformer of the church way before Luther ever showed up. But finally, the Moors were kicked out of Spain. What year were they kicked out of Spain? You all know what year they were kicked out of Spain. 1492. Because that's what allowed Ferdinand and Isabel, once they finally kicked him out of Granada, right? Yeah, sure, Granada. Then, of course, they had some extra money and they were able to finance Columbus off to the New World. Columbus goes off to the New World. Not only does he discover 2 new continents to turn Catholic, but buku gold comes back. Would you ever like to see the very first gold that Columbus sent back to the New World? You can see it so easily. You don't even need to buy a ticket the next time you go to Rome. Go to Rome. Go to the Church of St. Mary Majors, which is the most important church dedicated to Our Lady in the world, right? Walk in. Look up at the magnificent ceiling, the gold ceiling. That is the very first gold Columbus sent back to Ferdinand and Isabel. They gave it to the Pope to decorate the ceiling. Yes, Paul?
Mnsgr, when did the Spanish monarchs gain the right to appoint their own bishops?
They had had that way before. Most European monarchs did. Paul, as I'd said, one of the great problems of the church was the interference of the secular authority with church appointments. The great classic example of that is when Henry IV of England wanted to appoint his crony, Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Becket, exactly. But Thomas has this religious conversion. He doesn't do what the king says, and of course he's murdered in Canterbury Cathedral, okay? The Pope didn't have the authority to appoint most bishops well until the late 18th, early 19th century. Often they were technically elected by chapters of canons, would be the cathedral clergy, but those were controlled by the king. They'd been controlled in England by the king for centuries before the Reformation. And so the Catholic monarchs only did have the power to appoint bishops, subject to confirmation by the Pope. That was the one thing the popes ever did give up, okay? And believe it or not, in part of France, the president of France still has the power to appoint the bishops. In Alsace-Lorraine. But you see, you ask these questions and I get off topic, and so we can talk about that anyway. But Spain becomes the home of the great reforming religious orders. It has the funds for the reform. It's a reformed church itself. Protestantism never really gets a toehold in Spain. Spain and the Spanish Empire becomes the great political engine that fuels the Counter-Reformation, okay? Okay. Finally, another pope comes to the throne of Peter who promotes reform, and that's Paul III, 1534-1549. What did Paul III do? He elevated worthy men to the sacred college. He's the one who made St. John Fisher a cardinal, and thereby restoring the meaning of the red of the cardinal's robes, right? Because what's the red of the cardinal's robes supposed to show? Their willingness to shed their blood for the faith, right? And of course, he made St. John Fisher a cardinal while he was in the Tower of London, because he thought certainly Henry would never dare to behead a cardinal. He didn't realize how prideful and what a monomaniac Henry VIII had become by this point. Paul III begins to reform the curia, the papal administration. He tries to call a general council. Everyone's saying, we need an ecumenical council to deal with this. We need one, we need one. For 10 years, the Pope tries to call an ecumenical council, but he's not able to get the necessary players to agree to it. He's heartbroken. He dies before a council can be called. But Paul III supported these great new religious orders that would become the moving force behind the Catholic Reformation. We talk about the Theatines. The Capuchins come from this time. The Capuchins are the reform group of the Franciscans. And of course, our Friars of the Renewal are a reform group of the Capuchins. Franciscans keep on morphing. You know, they reform and then they get corrupt and they have to reform again and then they get corrupt and they have to reform again, you know. And already the Friars of the Renewal have had a reform off of them. There's a group that said they're too windy because they wear shoes instead of sandals if there's snow, and so, you know, that other group has gone that way. We'll talk about the Ursulines, but they were supported by Paul III. But supremely, of all the new religious orders that Paul III supported, the one that was most important in the Catholic Reformation were the Jesuits. La Compañía de Jesus, the Jesuits. The Jesuits, of course, are inseparable from St. Ignatius of Loyola. Really, born in northern Spain in 1491. He was really Basque, and so was St. Francis Xavier, or Basque. St. Ignatius of Loyola, born there, noble family, destined to be a soldier, dreams about being a soldier. Finally, you know, Dad outfits him, and he goes out his very first battle. Cannonball comes, shatters his leg. Well, that's the end of his military career. He's stuck in the castle while he's recuperating. He tries to read every book he can because he's bored stiff. You see, they don't have, you know, the dish back then, or Cable One, or anything like this. And he finally tells his mother, is there nothing more for me to read around here? And she says, well, there's this book, and there's the Golden Legend, the Lives of the Saints. Well, what the heck, you know, I guess it's better than staring at the walls. And at this time he was a Catholic, but not devout in particular, you know. And he reads it, and of course it transforms his life. Because these men were flesh and blood just as I am. He goes off, determined to devote his life to Christ. He goes to the beautiful shrine of our Blessed Mother in Catalonia in Spain, at Montserrat, puts his sword on the altar of the Blessed Mother there at Montserrat, then goes off to Manresa, M-A-N-R-E-S-A, which is up there in northeast Spain also. I've been to the house where he stayed for a year in prayer. And there he wrote the Spiritual Exercises. It's probably one of the most important spiritual writings in the history of Christianity, which is a process built around the 30-day retreat of discerning God's will. That's the basic theme of the spirituality of St. Ignatius, it's discernment. After this, he feels that God's calling him to go to the Holy Land, but first he wants to be ordained a priest, goes to the University of Paris to do his studies. There he meets his fellow Spaniard, St. Francis Xavier, and meets with 3 other men, shares his vision with them. They do the spiritual exercises together, and they take a vow that they will be united doing the work of God, and they say, we're going to go to the Holy Land, and there convert the Moors, but if we can't make it to the Holy Land, we'll go to Rome and tell the Pope, we will do whatever you want us to do. They go to Venice. Venice is at war with Turkey. They refuse to transport him to the Holy Land. So thank God, that was the happiest war ever took place, because the Jesuits instead would be in the Holy Land nowadays doing who knows what. They go to Rome, meet with Pope Paul III, offer their services to him, maybe the fourth power of the Jesuits, to give themselves especially to the Pope for his mission. And the Jesuits begin. St. Ignatius is elected as the first general of the order. He dies 1556. When he dies, there are already 1,000 Jesuits. Already 1,000 Jesuits spreading throughout Europe. A product of an amazing educational system that St. Ignatius himself developed, which the Jesuits called the curriculum, for two great purposes: to defend the faith in its homeland and to spread it to the missions that are opening at this point. It will be the Jesuits who regain entire provinces and countries to the faith. That the Czech Republic is a Catholic country today, instead of Protestant, is due to the Jesuits. To a large, that Poland is Catholic today. Poland almost went Protestant. Is due to the Jesuits. Austria, due to the Jesuits. Bavaria, due to the Jesuits. And we give many other examples. It was the Jesuits who did the historic mission to England to keep the faith alive there in the worst of the time of the persecutions. The Jesuits who established the great Roman universities that then trained seminarians from all over the world to be able to go back. And the Jesuits who are the great missionaries of the church at this time. Like I said, the world was opening up at this moment. We had lost Northern Europe to the Reformation, but thanks to the Portuguese, the East is opening up. Thanks to Columbus, the West, the New World is opening up. The missions of the Far East, inseparable with the name of St. Francis Xavier, companion of St. Ignatius, filled with this longing to go and preach the gospel. Amazing man. Went to India, preached the gospel there, established the church there in Goa. Though he found Christians already present. He discovered St. Thomas had got into India, 1,500 years before him. Okay, is your family St. Thomas Christian? Oh, beautiful.
We're here in Malabar, so.
Yeah, Malabar, right. I have a family in the parish of Malabar, right?
Yeah, I know that.
Oh,
They have a network.
yeah. I bet, oh, I'm sure. But then goes on to Japan for what was initially an incredibly successful mission in Japan. There's the Sad, Strange movie outside of us. Now, that's a movie to be watched with great spiritual discernment, okay? But it's a true story. St. Francis Xavier goes to Japan. One time there were 300,000 Catholics in Japan. But then, of course, there was a change in the shogun, and there was a persecution of the church. And really, the movie is kind of showing how diabolical persecution can be, is what it is. But St. Francis Xavier's great dream was China. He goes to China, and he dies he lands, and he dies there on the shore. He gets to China, but that's all. But the Jesuits continue his mission. And we don't have time to go into it, but fascinating, the techniques they used in China, which eventually led to a big controversy called the Chinese Stripes controversy. Like, they said, well, the Chinese, it's okay for them to still honor Confucius as a national hero, like we might honor George Washington, or Abraham Lincoln. But they said ancestor worship, they're not really worshiping their ancestors, they're honoring their ancestors. And it's okay for Christians to honor ancestors. And hello, gentlemen, how are you? Hello. And that it's really like praying for the dead, like we Christians do. But they got into a big tussle with the Dominicans. The Dominicans said, oh no, this is horrible, this is corrupting Christianity. They have nothing to do with Confucius. And Rome decided on the side of the Dominicans. So the Chinese the mission kind of stalled out. Same thing in India. They were amazing because what made converting so hard in India was the caste system. because you're supposed to bring everyone together in one church, but India was very segmented into castes. And so you had Jesuits going and dressing up like swamis to talk to the Brahmins and things like this. And again, the Dominicans got all weirded out. But it was really the beginning of the great evangelization of these. Yes?
In a way, didn't the caste system make it easier for the untouchables to get into Christianity because it freed them?
Of course. And it's primarily among the untouchables that the converts to Christianity have been made, which is most fitting, because that's who our Lord came for. The problem is when you get converts from other castes, they don't want to be in the same congregation, so this is complicated things, but yes, the untouchables have been the great source of converts in India. So we had this amazing mission that took place that only one country completely accepted the gospel in Asia, and that of course would be the Philippines. They're the only Christian Catholic country in Asia, though later on substantial minorities in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere were made. And now in India, where that work continues, I think China is on the verge of accepting the gospel. We're going to see in the 20th century, sub-Saharan Africa became Christian. In the 21st century, I think we're going to see China become Christian. The old order is caved in and there's nothing to take its place. If we Catholics will be able to plug into it, it's going to be hard to say. But anyhow, this is all the fruit of the great Jesuit missionaries that came at the time of the Catholic Reformation. But there was a new world too, Spanish America. And it was wide open. And it was Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and Jesuits. Those were the four great orders that came with the conquistadors to spread the faith. Many great saints at this point. St. Louis Bertrand, who was the great apostle of Colombia. St. Francis Solano, who converted Peru. St. Peter Claver, who ministered to the slaves in Venezuela. St. Trivius, I should remember because in my seminary, the chapel, where I was ordained everything but a priest. I got all my minor orders and diaconate there. St. Trivius, the great Archbishop of Lima in Peru, traveled 50,000 miles in his life. And this is before cars at all, of course. Visiting his diocese, he confirmed countless people. Who was one of the people that St. Trivius confirmed in Lima, Peru? St. Rose of Lima, the first saint born in the Americas. And so from the beginning, we have this flowering of holiness taking place. Who was the greatest evangelizer of Latin America, Spanish America?
Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Our Lady of Guadalupe, of course, the Blessed Virgin. She herself was the great evangelizer, and it's an amazing story. But we know there was a big problem with the evangelization of Americas, the cruelty of the conquistadors, the cruelty of the Spanish government and the Portuguese government in Brazil. And this was condemned. Pope Paul VI, the third, condemned this cruelty. And a great Dominican priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, wrote a famous book attacking the cruelty being shown to the Indians. The Indians were the church was the great defender of the rights of the Indians and keeping them from being enslaved. The Jesuits reached the high point of this with the famous reductions of Paraguay. Have you ever seen the movie The Mission?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you have to see. You
That's
need to
awesome.
see. I thought college kids watched movies a lot. Maybe it's just us parish priests who said about watching movies. I don't know. But, get it on Netflix. The Mission. Jeremy Irons plays one of the priests. Robert De Niro's in it. Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons. It's about the reductions in Paraguay, which were these beautiful kind of self-governing Indian republics that the church sponsored, where the Indians flourished. And then, of course, there were the Canadian missions. That resulted in great martyrs too, St. Isaac, Jogues, and his companions. Well, we have all this going on. You see, I talk too long. Anyhow. Finally, in 1545, an ecumenical council can be called. The emperor, the Holy Roman Emperors, insisted that it be held not in Rome, but in some city under his control, so that the Protestant emissaries who go there can be guaranteed safe conduct. But the Pope doesn't want it outside of Italy. So they agree in this little city up in the Italian Alps, Trento, or in English, Trent. Trent is one of those cities, you have to check. One century it's Italian, the next century it's German, it bounces back and forth. And Trento is way up in the north of Italy, and going up into the Italian Alps. And this is where December 13th, 1545, finally, an ecumenical council is called to deal with the question of the Reformation. It went on for almost 20 years. It wasn't closed until 1564. It was suspended a number of times. One time it was suspended for 10 years, and it looked like it would never be called back again. But thanks to perseverance, and at the end especially, St. Charles Borromeo, it finally came to its conclusion. The council had two great purposes. Number one, to defend Catholic doctrine against the Protestant errors, and number two, the reform of the church. And at the beginning there was a big debate. Should we talk about doctrine first and then reform, or do we talk about reform first and then doctrine? And it was finally the Pope who said, well, why don't you talk about them both at the same time? And broke down the deadlock that had been reached over that. The Council of Trent is very well written and is classic. The decrees of the Council of Trent, every decree comes in two parts. First is what's called the chapter, and that's the positive statement of the Catholic faith. It's followed by the canons, which are the list of errors against that. And so when you read the Council of Trent, first let's say if it's on the real presence. This holy council assembled in the Holy Spirit, the church has always said that Christ is truly and substantially present, And then it follows the canons. The canons go, if anyone dare say that the bread does not cease to exist, the famous phrase, anathema sit. That's not the name of the dog. That's not something anathema sit. It literally means let him be damned or let him be condemned, okay? And that follows at the end of each of the canons. So it's this very exact statement of Catholic doctrine. And that was used for almost everything except towards the end, when St. Charles Borromeo was in a hurry to get the council finished. They issued simply some decrees that didn't have canons attached to them. The decree on purgatory is the most famous. When it comes to dogma, the council tackled everything that was being attacked by the Protestant reformers. It defended scripture and tradition as the two sources of divine revelation. It defended the inspiration of the deuterocanonical books, what the Protestants call the Apocrypha of the Bible, those 7.5 books of the Old Testament that we accept but they don't, okay? The council insisted that scripture be interpreted according to the mind of the church. The council set forth the correct understanding of original sin, which of course Luther had attacked and had even been more attacked by Calvin, teaching that original sin causes total depravity, which Catholics reject, okay? One of the most important decrees was the decree on justification, because that was Luther's big thing, right? How are we justified? How are we made right with God? In the Council of Trent, the decree is so famous. It goes, yes, God gives prevenient grace. He gives the first grace. And God gives the grace of conversion. And God gives the grace of persevering. But man does not do nothing. There, in that phrase, is the difference between the Catholic and Protestant understanding of justification. Yes, God has to give us the grace in the first place to even be moved to believe. And God gives us the grace to be converted to believe. And God has to give us the grace to persevere. But man does not do nothing. That's opposed to Calvin. It really helped. Man did nothing. God creates some souls to go to heaven to show his mercy. He creates some souls to go to hell to show his justice. And we really don't have much to do with it. The interplay, the mysterious interplay of free will with divine grace. All summed up in that one little phrase that the council used. But man does not do nothing. We are cooperators in our justification. Very important phrase. They talked about all the sacraments in general and each sacrament in particular, defending them against the errors of the Protestants. Defended the sacrificial nature of the Mass. The famous decree on purgatory, which is a classic. The decree on purgatory, it's very short because the council had to say something. And it's the decree on purgatory, the classic council of Trent says, "We thereby tell the faithful, there is a purgatory, and the souls there can be helped by our prayers, and all other speculation is most unhelpful and keep it out of sermons." That really is the summary. Because, towards the High Middle Ages, preachers were notorious for telling very dramatic stories, often connected with money, about, what did Tetzel, I'm sure, Paul, did you talk about Tetzel last week?
When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from
Purgatory
springs.
springs. Yes. I teach that to my people every All Souls Day before the collection. No. The council defended the invocation veneration of the saints. It defended sacred images. It defended indulgences. So these are the great dogmatic decrees. The Reformed decrees for the laity made plain what the impediments to marriage were, because there was uncertainty about it. Did away with, it made invalid, clandestine marriages and surprise marriages. It said clandestine marriages were invalid and surprise marriages were invalid. It was the Council of Trent, the decree Ne Temisti, that said for a valid marriage, a couple must be married either by their bishop or by their pastor or priest delegated by them, and there must be 2 witnesses, and the officiant must ask for and receive the vows. Now, that sounds like a lot. What would that all be about? Ask for and receive the vows. Well, you see, before, at the Second Lateran Council, they'd said for a valid marriage, a couple has to be married with 2 witnesses in front of their bishop or their parish priest, okay? So, what did people do if they want to get married and their parents were opposed and they knew the priest was opposed? It's 2 o'clock in the morning. And Father Arthur's deep asleep in his bed. And he hears bang, bang, bang at the door. Father, open up! Father, open up! So there he is in his pajamas, and he opens up the door, and who's standing there but John and Mary and their 2 friends. I take you for my husband, I take you for my wife. They were validly married. They'd said their vows in front of the parish priest. Erasmus's parents were married that way. Surprise marriage. It was a valid marriage because all the law of the church said in front of your priest you have to say your vows and 2 witnesses. So the Council of Trent added, the priest has to ask for and receive the vows. And that's why now, I can't remember, it's been a long time since I've looked at the marriage rite in the Byzantine rite, but in the Roman rite, the priest has to say, and therefore I ask you to now state your intentions. So that eliminated, the Council of Trent eliminated the possibility of a surprise marriage, where the poor priest could be out grocery shopping and suddenly, the couple shows up. In fact, there's stories about, in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, priests knowing that a couple wanted to get married, surprise, and he'd see the couple coming, he'd start running away. Because they were going to try to get married, okay? And for bad dueling, and said that those who did duels were excommunicated. Far more important were the reform decrees for the clergy. Said that the Sacred College of Cardinals should have cardinals from the entire church gathered about, not be so heavy on Italians. It said bishops must live in their diocese. It said there must be parish visitations. Bishops need to go out and visit the parishes and make sure that they're being done in good order. It told pastors to live in their parishes. And a lot of this still continues in the canon law to this day. The Council of Trent decreed priests were to preach to their people every Sunday and Holy Day. Something that's still verbatim in the canon law to this day. Priests were to teach the people the faith and see that the children were catechized. It ordered the establishment in every diocese of a seminary. Down in Mexico, the seminaries are still called El Seminario Conciliar, the council seminary. And what council is that referring to? The Council of Trent. The seminary is ordered by the Council of Trent. Now, eventually, popes ended up giving dispensations from this because some dioceses were too small to have seminaries. So they were given permission to team up with other dioceses to be able to staff a seminary. Pluralism was forbidden. Priests could not hold more than one office. You couldn't be the pastor of 4 parishes at the same time and be taking an income from them all. Anything involving money was forbidden in indulgences, which of course was the thing that actually pushed Luther over the edge, right? Was the preaching of the indulgence for building St. Peter's, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself. I mean, giving alms is a holy work. There's no reason why in and of itself, why giving alms shouldn't be an indulgence work. And to want to build a new church for the tomb of the Prince of the Apostles, and the indulgence that Leo X had proclaimed, you had to go to confession, you had to go to communion, you had to pray for the Pope, and you gave a donation to St. Peter's according to your means. Well, that's a pious work, okay? But the transaction of money made it look seedy. It made it look seedy. And especially because the Pope had already borrowed the money to build St. Peter's from the house of Mnsgr, which was a Jewish lending house. And so, the word gets out. Part of this money that you're donating to St. Peter's is going to pay the interest to these Jewish bankers who have loaned the Pope the money, and anti-Semitism was still rather rampant in Europe at that time, as it was in different forms for many centuries, and that didn't help. And there was the reform of the religious orders also. The council then told the Pope, before it closed, would you please come up with a catechism, a standard breviary, and a standard missal for the Roman Rite to use. The standard catechism was basically written by St. Charles Borromeo, and that was called the Roman Catechism. It's the immediate predecessor of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, meant primarily for the clergy to assist them in preaching, and had a tremendous effect on the church in preaching, the Roman Catechism, which was the catechism of the church up until, when did the Catechism of the Catholic Church come out? About 82, 83, something like that. And so the Roman Catechism had a huge effect. The standard Roman breviary came out, and of course the Roman Missal of Pius V came out. That was the standard of the Roman liturgy for all that time. It was with the Council of Trent that really the fullness of the Catholic Reformation had come about. If we had more time, if you ever have me back, I would love to talk to you about the different leaders, the great saints of the Catholic Reformation. We would take another hour and a half talking about them. And just in brief, but we really deserve to go much deeper. Who were the figures that really made the Catholic Reformation happen? We've already talked about St. Ignatius of Loyola, certainly. St. Charles Borromeo, who, amazing man. He had everything going for him to be a corrupt clergyman. Nephew of the Pope, wealthy family, aristocratic family. His older brother died, and he could have, while he was still a subdeacon, and he could have gotten out from it all and become the duke. But he gave that all up, was of great assistance to his uncle, who was Pius, I should remember this well, Pius the Fourth, that's right. Great assistance to his uncle, Pius the Fourth. Brought the Council of Trent to conclusion, went back to Milan, which is way up in northern Italy, the big diocese, biggest diocese in Europe, huge. First time a bishop had been there in 80 years, that I mentioned, and became the classic example of what a bishop should be. Many events. He reformed the clergy. He was so hard on his clergymen that they actually one of his priests tried to shoot him during Vespers. And you know, over what? St. Charles told the priests they had to shave their beards.
Oh.
Yeah, no, traditionally, it was very different. Eastern Rite clergymen wear beards. You know, I went to Russia this summer, and, you know, like the monks, huge beards, because you're not supposed to trim them or groom them, because that's being vain and all that sort of business, okay? In the Roman Rite, traditionally, priests would be clean-shaven, okay? Wearing a beard is considered vain. But at that time in Milan, it was considered effeminate. Wearing a beard showed your manliness, right? And being clean-shaven was effeminate. So the clergy got really angry. They said, you know, we don't want to look like a bunch of wimps, you know, and without beards. But St. Charles said, if you don't shave your beards, I'll suspend you, that's it. And so he's saying Vespers, and one day some priest comes in with an old blunderbuss and gets him in the back. But he was wearing those old-fashioned Baroque vestments with all the heavy metal ornament, so he just got a bad bruise off. And all over telling the priests to shave their beards. Well, St. Charles did many beautiful things. I read his biography, it's charming. But the most beautiful thing is when the plague hit Milan, and he took his palace and turned it into a hospital. And that's a famous scene that's been painted many times. He, with his own hands, ministered to the plague victims in his own house. He ordered the curtains torn down and sold to raise money to feed the plague victims. And St. Charles Borromeo, to this day, is like the great standard of what a bishop is supposed to be. Here was a man who had everything going for him to be a corrupt clergyman, and he turned out to be one of the most sublime, beautiful characters. St. Philip Neri. You know, the reforming popes were kind of harsh, like Pius V, and kind of turned Rome into a monastery. And there would have been the danger almost of a Puritanism coming into the church. St. Charles Neri was the second apostle of Rome. Simply one of the most lovely saints who ever existed. He was the joyful saint, and always a priest, and his whole thing was getting people together, groups like this, in prayer groups, which they called oratories. That's why the group of priests he founded are called oratorians, because he'd get people together in prayer groups to pray, to sing, to study, and by his simple goodness and his joy, he was the joyful saint, a very gentle saint, reconverted the city of Rome. The Romans are still to this day very devoted to St. Philip Neri, who of course is the patron saint of Albuquerque, right? San Felipe de Neri. That's St. Philip Neri. I mean, he's the patron saint of our city. And then the great Carmelite saints who came about at this time. St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. St. Teresa of Avila, who plunged the spiritual, and she herself was kind of a lukewarm nun. She was never evil, okay, she wasn't corrupt. She was lukewarm. And of course then she had her conversion, and symbolized when the angel of divine love came and pierced her heart with the arrow of divine love, which you can see Bernini's statue of that in the American Church in Rome. It's one of the most beautiful works of art, but it's nothing compared to what the reality must have been. And the mystical life was revealed to her. supremely, and she wrote the two books, The Way of Perfection, The Interior Castle, about the spiritual life, which are still the standards. But she was a very down-to-earth, common-sense nun who founded 43 monasteries of, the Discalced Carmelites, the Carmelites that don't wear shoes. That's what Discalced means, the Reformed Carmelites. And his sister was suffering from depression and spiritual dryness. He said, "Oh, Mother, what do I need to do?" And you know what St. Teresa of Avila told her? Go eat a good steak. Said, you just need some good food inside you. That's what you need, I'm very down to earth, very practical, And it's the famous story, the nobleman came up to St. Teresa of Avila, because she was famous in her own lifetime. "Oh, Mother, tell me, what is prayer?" And she breaks out laughing and says, "Don't you know prayer is talking with God?" And she had no time for pomposity, whatever. Of course, her great helper was St. John of the Cross, who brought about the reform of the Carmelites on the men's side. And so here, again, these are the great saints that God raised up at this time. But we will stop here because it is getting late, I know. And so, any questions, comments? Yes?
Do you see the Baroque period in art as a continuation of the Renaissance art form, or more something of its own nature coming out of the Catholic Reformation?
A little bit more of its own nature, because the Renaissance was an attempt to reproduce classical forms as perfectly as they could. Okay, the Renaissance, the rebirth. Okay. They're digging up every old Roman statue that they can find, and they're copying it, and it's this great desire to really reproduce classical forms, okay? And of course, by the time we get to the Baroque, well, people have gotten bored with the classical forms, because they're very somber, they're very sober, okay? The Baroque is exuberant and triumphalistic. That would be a time when we go to artwork. This is where you get these amazing paintings. Like the triumph, there's a French artist, I remember his name, about the year 1620, did a big painting called The Triumph of Holy Church. And it's this majestic Baroque chariot. And there's a woman dressed in flowing robes that represents the church. And she's holding a monstrance, okay? And this huge, massive chariot is going. And underneath the wheels are Luther and Calvin and Henry VIII and all this. And it's the triumph of Holy Church. It's exuberant. And you see the church bounce back with such incredible confidence. And the Baroque really expressed that exuberance, that unbounded energy that the church now felt that she had gotten her footing again after and the Baroque wasn't just for church architecture, but it certainly was captured in that. And St. Peter's would be the example. The new St. Peter's is in-your-face Catholicism. No apologies, Sorry, Protestants, here we are, Just watch us produce the world's biggest church.
Sorry, not sorry.
Yes, you have a question.
Is it true that the Council of Trent proclaimed St. Thomas's philosophy as the philosophy of the Catholic Church?
Almost, not quite, okay? The Council of Trent said, the good question, said that St. Thomas was very trustworthy and a sure guide. He did not proclaim that his philosophy was the philosophy of the Catholic Church. Actually, Leo XIII was the closest to get to saying that in one of his encyclicals. Though it's fascinating, at every session of the Council of Trent, on the table in the middle was placed the Bible, Gratian's Decretals, which are kind of the antique version of canon law, and the Summa Theologica. They were on the table there for every session of the Council of Trent. But it didn't say that his philosophy was the philosophy of the Catholic Church. It said he is a most trustworthy guide. It's kind of like what they said, people get confused. They passed a decree about the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible. The Council of Trent did not say that the Vulgate is an inspired translation. church has never said that any translation is inspired. What it said was the Vulgate is trustworthy. It's a good enough translation to be used to settle questions of doctrine. That's what they said about the Vulgate. It didn't say it was an inspired translation or the translation of the church. Yes?
I guess my real question is, why don't we see Thomistic thought in a lot of our seminaries today?
Isn't that a good question? Okay. Though, I mean, there's a big revival of Thomism in our seminaries nowadays. Heck of a lot better than when I was in. Though, you know, I went in during, you know, maybe you've heard of this book, Goodbye Good Men. You heard about it?
That was our
Well, we were in, we're the survivors.
We were the good men who got through.
That's right. But even, I mean, with me, we had a full solid year of Thomism. I mean, you know, when I was in college seminary at St. Thomas in Denver, we had one full year of Thomism. So even in the bad, dark days, it didn't disappear. I mean, we had solid, and actually it was a pretty darn good education in the philosophy of St. Thomas. And that's all we studied for 1 year. Because you had history of philosophy, and then you'd specialize in some of the philosophers, you know, your senior year. But Thomism is still there, of course. And you know, Leo XIII is the one who promoted the modern revival of Thomism. And Father Karl Rahner, no matter what you think about him, really is the modern interpreter of Thomism. He always claimed to be nothing but a Thomist. And you know, Father Rahner had a huge influence on theology, especially in the first half of the 1900s, or in, you know, the middle 1900s. Paul.
So I'm Protestant Paul, Pastor Raun. I won't call you Father because Jesus said to call no man Father, but that's not what I'm going to ask about. So in
This has
Galatians,
something to do with the Counter-Reformation course, right?
yes. So in Galatians 2, Paul says that when I saw they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, which, as you know, is Greek, the Greek transliteration of Kepha, which is Peter. So that's referring to Peter, who you call the first pope. In front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not simple Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law, no one will be justified. So it seems
you
really
all could
clear to
answer
me
that for yourselves.
that you guys follow a works-based religion, which isn't the gospel. That St. Paul told us, you know, not to fall away from, even if an angel from heaven should preach another gospel to us.
Just be careful.
Not those who say, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. For I was hungry and you fed me not, and I was thirsty and you gave me not drink. Therefore go to where it's prepared for Satan.
Very good.
We've got time for one more.
Wonderful.
So, like, how come there was such a long stretch of non-Italian popes from Pope Adrian VI all the way to John Paul II?
Oh, well, sure, because the church had gotten kind of burned. Well, the church had gotten burned about having non-Italian popes, okay? And there's a little bit of sense to this, because you think about it. Normally people like to have a bishop who's of their own country. And so, I mean, he is the Bishop of Rome. So here they were having Germans who didn't even speak their language, made their bishop. And they were, or Frenchmen, who only held them in contempt, made their bishop. Nicholas Breakspear. What's famous about Nicholas Breakspear? Hadrian VI. Only English bishop. Only English pope, excuse me. Only English pope. Hadrian did you ever read the novel Hadrian VII? Did you ever read Hadrian VII?
No.
Oh, it's the ultimate fantasy about this guy who gets elected as the second English pope. It's a crazy book, but it's interesting. It's very well written. But anyhow, the Italians didn't like having non-Italians made their bishops. And the last time they tried that, of course, that's what had resulted in, you know, the Babylonian exile, going to Avignon, and then the Great Schism. And so the church has said, well, It's an Italian city, it's Italian people, they deserve to have an Italian bishop. But, in reality, who actually runs the day-to-day?
Korea.
Well, actually, it's the Cardinal Vicar General of Rome. The Pope takes one of the cardinals, appoints him as the Vicar General for the Diocese of Rome, and he's the one who actually functions on a day-to-day basis as the Bishop of Rome. So, I think things have changed. The Italians realize that if the papacy is now international, it only adds to the prestige of the papacy. Though I would say to this day, I can't imagine them ever electing a cardinal that didn't speak Italian.
Yeah.
How could you be the Bishop of Rome and not be able to talk to your people?
Because it's still the official language of the Curia.
Yeah.
All of the departments that run the church, you have to speak Italian because the vast majority of the staff is Italian. So, yeah, they're always going to be looking for somebody. That's how John Paul II, when he came out on the balcony, and it was just enormous because they were running all over the seminary saying, we have a pope, but he's from Poland. And he came out on the balcony, and he was very, very smart. He said, I come from a country far away. You will have to help me speak our Italian language. And they all loved him. As soon as he said that, he had Rome in his pocket.
And even though the Vicar General of Rome is a cardinal, he's the one who appoints parish priest and worries about all this. Still, the Pope tries to set a good example what a bishop should be. He goes out to visit parishes in Rome and all. He gives sermons to different groups and stuff like this. And for him to not be able to speak Italian, to talk to his own Pope, it just, and not all the cardinals necessarily speak Italian. It'd be very hard to have a non-Italian-speaking Pope. But that's why, you get, our present Holy Father, the reason he speaks Italian is because his father was Italian. Well, half Italian. Half Italian. His mother is Hispanic. His mother's Argentinian. His dad
was Spanish. Oh.
Yeah, I think.
I thought both
I thought
parents
both
came
of his
from
parents
Were
were
both
immigrants
from
from Italy.
Yeah, I think they both immigrated.
Okay. I'm trying to remember.
But he grew up speaking Spanish.
Yeah, sure, of course. Did they both immigrate? Okay. His father for sure.
Bergoglio, pretty unusual Spanish name.
Yeah. Well, no, his father's Italian. Yeah. So, but then you see in Joseph Ratzinger, well, he lived.
He lived there for so
He
long.
lived there forever, and he'd been there as a student. He spoke Italian about as well as he spoke German.
Yeah.
A brilliant man, right? A brilliant man, the Holy Father Emeritus.
Another reason was Italy was not united until 1870. And they were very reluctant after the Avignon papacy to elect a pope who came from a world power. And that was a great fear. They almost elected who was it, Mary del Val or
Rampolla.
Rampolla, and the Emperor of Austria-Hungary had the right to veto it. He had told his cardinal from Vienna and Budapest, he said, don't allow them to elect Rampolla, I hate him. And so, the world powers had that kind of influence as late as 1914.
Yeah.
So what we are used to of the papacy of today is really a totally different ballgame of what you've grown up with. John Paul II, Benedict XVI. What we grew up with was Italy.
Well, yeah, and the influence of the Roman mob, the great schism of the church, the great Western schism with the three popes. It goes back to where, the French Pope finally comes back to Rome because St. Catherine of Siena is embarrassing him into it, And he dies, the Pope. So the cardinals meet. There's a small majority of French cardinals. The Roman mob is scared to death. They're going to elect another Frenchman who will go back to Avignon. They get on top of the Sistine Chapel, begin tearing off the tiles of the roof and pouring down hot oil and tiles on the cardinals. unless they quickly elect an Italian.
Oh my God.
So they elect the Italian, he's enthroned, the French cardinals say bye-bye, and as soon as they're out of Rome, say, we were coerced. This was not a fair election. We're electing a pope, who's a Frenchman, of course. So you have the Italian states with their pope, you have the French with theirs, and then the two won't give up, and so some of the bishops they will call a council, and they elect Peter de Luna, who takes Benedict something, I forget, but then the other two popes aren't going to recognize him, so we end up with 3 popes. It was a big mess. Very good. Friends, I enjoyed it. I hope, forgive me, I talked a lot, forgive me.
You were great.
This is lovely.